Dad, can you sit at the back? I don't want people to see you near the altar, my daughter Rachel whispered as she adjusted her veil, without even looking in my direction. I was standing at the entrance to the church, holding the small bouquet of cheap flowers I had bought for her with my last paycheck. The words hit me like a punch in the stomach, but I kept up the forced smile I had practiced in the mirror that morning. Sure, honey. Whatever you want, I replied softly, feeling the weight of the curious glances from the well-dressed guests around me. My name is Charles, I'm 52 years old, and I've just been rejected by the person I love most in the world, my only daughter. This isn't how I imagined this day would begin. 25 years ago, when Rachel was born, I swore I would make any sacrifice to ensure she had everything I never had. When my wife abandoned us, she was only 3, I worked 3 different jobs to pay for her piano lessons, her pretty dresses, her private education. I sold my car to pay for her graduation. I mortgaged the house to pay for her law school. I used my retirement savings to help her open the law firm that now earns her more in a month than I earned in a year. Today, she was marrying David, the son of a traditional family in town. I should have been walking her down the aisle, giving her away to the man she chose. But the last words we exchanged before the ceremony made it clear to me where I really stood in her new life. I sat in the back row, between an elderly couple who didn't know me. My suit, the same one he wore 10 years ago to job interviews, stood in stark contrast to the elegant attire around me. My calloused hands, which had built furniture for her bedroom when we were poor, now trembled slightly as I leafed through the ceremony program. Father Michael began the ceremony, his solemn voice echoing off the ancient walls of the church. I watched my little girl beautiful in her $3,000 dress, a price I knew because she had mentioned it during an argument about unnecessary expenses with my attendants at the wedding. "Who gives her away?" asked the priest, following traditional protocol. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel glanced back quickly, her eyes passing over me as if I were invisible, before whispering something to David. "Rachel has decided to walk down the aisle alone," David replied, his voice carrying a tone of embarrassed apology. "She is an independent and strong woman." I felt my heart break a little more. For years, I had dreamed of this moment. I imagined how proud I would be walking beside her, how I would whisper words of encouragement in his ear, how I would hug her before giving her away to the man who promised to love her. Instead, I was watching from afar, like a stranger. Father Michael paused awkwardly, his eyes scanning the congregation until they found mine. There was something in his gaze that I couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of compassion and determination that made me sit up straighter in my chair. During his sermon on family and sacrifice, he continued to look at me. These weren't discreet glances. They were direct, intentional looks that began to attract the attention of other guests. "True love," he said, her voice growing intense, "often comes from people who sacrifice everything without asking for anything in return. From people who build bridges for others to cross, even though they know they may never receive the recognition they deserve." Rachel looked uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other. David frowned, clearly confused about where the sermon was going. "Before we proceed with the vows," the priest said, closing the book in her hands, "I would like to ask the congregation a direct question." The air in the church grew tense. This was not the normal wedding script everyone had expected. The priest looked directly at Rachel, then at his, and then at the entire church filled with people. "If you are enjoying this story about family, sacrifice, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming content." "Rachel Thompson," he said, using her maiden name with an authority that silenced the entire church, "do you really believe you can start a new family while disrespecting the man who sacrificed everything to build the woman you have become today?" The priest's question echoed through the church like thunder. Rachel turned pale, his fists clenching at her sides. David looked confused between her and the priest, clearly not understanding what was happening. "Father Michael," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't think I understand your question." "I think you understood perfectly," he replied, taking a few steps toward the altar where she stood. "Then I'll rephrase it more clearly. There is a man sitting in the back row of this church who mortgaged his house to pay for your education. Who worked 3 jobs simultaneously so you could take piano lessons. Who sold his only car to cover the costs of her graduation." Each word from the priest hit Rachel like a hammer. She glanced back quickly, her eyes meeting mine for a split second before looking away again. "That same man," the priest continued, "used all his retirement savings to help her open her law practice. And today, on what should be a celebration of love and family, You treated him like an inconvenient stranger." The silence in the church was so deep that I could hear my own heart beating. Some of the guests began to whisper, looking between me and Rachel with expressions of surprise and discomfort. David held Rachel's hand, trying to offer support, but she pulled it away abruptly. "Father, with all due respect," she said, her voice taking on that professional tone I knew so well, "my personal life is not a topic to be discussed during our wedding ceremony." "Her personal life," the priest repeated, his eyebrow rising. "Rachel, we are here to celebrate family, commitment, unconditional love. How can we talk about these values while you publicly disrespect the man who has exemplified all of them in his life?" It was at that moment that I realized Father Michael knew more about my history with Rachel than I had imagined. Over the past 6 months, since she announced her engagement, I had tried multiple times to talk to her. I wanted to be there to help with the planning, to walk her down the aisle, her, as we had always dreamed. Each attempt was met with polite but firm excuses. "I'm too busy, Dad. Maybe next week. The planner has everything under control." Gradually, I came to understand that my presence was seen more as an embarrassment than a blessing. Rachel grew up and became successful, but she also became ashamed of her humble origins. When she met David and his upper-class family, I became an inconvenient reminder of a past she would rather forget. "He did what any father would do," Rachel finally said, but her voice sounded defensive, not convincing. "And I'm grateful for that. But that doesn't mean I have to follow outdated traditions or—" "Outdated traditions?" the priest interrupted her. "Are you calling the idea of honoring those who sacrifice themselves for you an outdated tradition?" David tried to intervene. "Maybe we should continue with the ceremony and discuss this later." "No," the priest said firmly. "There is no later for this moment, young man. This is a church, a sacred place where we speak the truth. And the truth is that this young woman is about to make vows about love, commitment, and family while treating his own father as if he were an embarrassing stranger." I felt tears stinging my eyes. For years, I swallowed my pain silently. When Rachel stopped calling me regularly, I told myself she was just busy building her career. When she started avoiding our Sunday dinners, I convinced myself she needed space to grow. When she moved to the fancier side of town and took 3 months to give me her new address, I pretended it didn't hurt. And when she announced her engagement via a Facebook post instead of a personal call, I simply smiled and congratulated her in the comments like any other acquaintance. But Father Michael was right. This wasn't just about traditions or wedding protocols. It was about basic respect, about recognizing the sacrifices made for unconditional love. "Do you know the whole story?" Rachel asked the priest, her voice now carrying an edge of desperation. "Do you know how many times he embarrassed me in front of my friends with his cheap clothes? How many times I had to explain why we didn't have a nice house like other families?" Her words hit me like physical punches. I always knew that our financial situation bothered her, but I never imagined she harbored so much resentment. "I remember," the priest said calmly, "a man who attended all her piano recitals, even after working 2 shifts in a row. Who never missed a school football game, even when it meant missing overtime at work." He paused, looking directly at Rachel. "And I remember a little girl who used to tell him how proud she was to have the hardest working father in the world." Rachel was silent, but I saw his hands trembling slightly. "What happened to that girl, Rachel?" the priest asked gently. "When exactly did you decide that his father's love was something to be ashamed of?" The congregation was completely silent, waiting for her answer. David looked completely lost, clearly realizing that there were aspects of his fiancée's life that he was completely unaware of. And me? I was sitting in the back row, finally hearing someone defend not only my dignity, but the value of all the years of sacrifice I had made with love. But what would Father Michael do next? And how would Rachel react when she realized that her perfect facade was crumbling in front of all her important guests? The truth was being revealed, but I had no idea how deep the priest was willing to dig. Rachel remained silent for long seconds that seemed like an eternity. Her hands were visibly shaking as she held the bouquet, and I could see the internal conflict reflected in her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice came out low, almost a whisper. "You don't understand, Father. She's always been an embarrassment." Those words cut through me like a cold blade. 25 years of sacrifice reduced to a single cruel sentence. "An embarrassment?" the priest repeated, her voice carrying genuine disbelief. "Rachel, tell me specifically how a man who worked 3 jobs to pay for your education became an embarrassment to you." She glanced around the church, clearly seeking support among the elegantly dressed guests. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. "He showed up at my graduations in dirty work clothes," she said, her voice gaining defensive strength. "He drove that old noisy car that left oil in the school parking lot. When my classmates asked about my family, I didn't know what to say." Every word was a stab. I remembered those graduations that she mentioned. I would rush from my double shift at the construction site straight to the school auditorium, with no time to change clothes. I drove my Ford 97 with pride, because even though it was old, I kept it running with my own hands to save money that could be used for her education. "And that justifies treating him like a stranger at his own wedding?" the priest asked, stepping forward. David tried to intervene again, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe we can work this out after the ceremony." "No," the priest interrupted him firmly. "David, you're about to marry her. Don't you think it's important to understand how she treats the people who have sacrificed for her?" It was at that moment that David seemed to really look at Rachel for the first time, as if seeing her through a different lens. "Rachel," he said slowly, "you never told me about the sacrifices that his father made for you." "Because it wasn't relevant," she replied quickly, but her voice sounded too defensive. "That was in the past. Now I'm successful, I have my own life, my own resources." "Resources that were built on the foundation he provided," the priest noted calmly. The tension in the church was palpable. Some guests whispered among themselves, others recorded discreetly with their cell phones. I realized that this moment was being documented, that Rachel's humiliation was being captured just as she had captured his. It was then that David's mother, Catherine Morrison, an elegant lady of local high society, rose from her seat in the front row. "Excuse me," she said, her sharp voice echoing through the church. "But I think I need to clarify something here." All eyes turned to her. Rachel looked hopeful for a moment, probably thinking her mother-in-law would support her. "I met Charles Morrison, Thompson, many years ago," Catherine continued, looking directly at Rachel. "He laid the hardwood floors in our house when my David was a child. I remember her arriving every day at 6 in the morning, working until late afternoon, and still always asking about her little girl." I felt my heart tighten. I had forgotten that I had worked at the Morrisons' house years ago. "He showed pictures of her to all the workers," Catherine continued. "He talked about how smart she was, how she got excellent grades, how he was saving every penny to send her to college. At the time I thought, what a devoted father. Her daughter is lucky to have someone who loves her so much." Rachel visibly paled. "And now," Catherine went on, her voice growing colder, "I find out that this same daughter, who benefited from so much love and sacrifice, treats her own father as if he were a disgrace. That tells me a lot about the character of the person my son is about to marry." The silence that followed was absolute. David looked between his mother and Rachel with an expression of growing shock. "Mom," he began, but Catherine raised her hand to silence him. "David, you raised her to value loyalty, gratitude, and family. Those qualities are important to me because they are important to the kind of person I hope you will be, and the kind of person I hope you will choose as your life partner." Rachel tried to speak, but Catherine wasn't finished. "If she is capable of treating her own father this way, how can we trust that he will treat you, or his future children, with the respect and gratitude they deserve when the going gets tough?" It was at that moment that I felt something shift inside me. For years, I had silently accepted Rachel's growing distance, convincing myself that it was natural, that it was part of the process of her becoming independent. Even when it hurt, I swallowed my pride and found excuses for his behavior. But listening to Catherine Morrison, a woman of the social elite whom Rachel so admired, defend not only my sacrifices but publicly question Rachel's character, something stirred within me. I slowly rose from the back row. The movement caught the attention of the entire church. Father Michael saw me and nodded slightly, as if encouraging me. "May I speak?" I asked, my voice coming out firmer than I expected. The priest nodded. "Please, Charles. This is her opportunity." I walked down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing in the absolute silence. When I reached the altar, I stopped and looked directly at Rachel. "You're right about some things," I began, my voice calm but charged with restrained emotion. "My clothes were dirty from work at her graduations. Because I went straight from the construction site so I wouldn't miss a single important moment in her life. She tried to look away, but I maintained eye contact. My car was old and noisy. Because I chose to keep a car running for 15 years instead of making monthly payments, so that every extra dollar could go toward her education. My voice began to rise. You say it was embarrassing. But do you know what's really embarrassing, Rachel? It's finding out that his daughter, whom you raised to be compassionate and grateful, has turned into someone who is ashamed of unconditional love. Tears began to form in her eyes, but I continued. For 25 years, every decision I made was with his future in mind. Every hour of overtime I worked, every luxury I denied myself, every silent sacrifice I made, it was all for you. I paused for a moment, feeling the weight of decades of unrequited love. And he's right about one thing, I really have turned into something embarrassing. Not because of his clothes or his car, but because he raised a daughter who confuses personal worth with bank account and professional success with character. The silence in the church was deafening. Rachel was crying openly now, but I wasn't finished yet. Father Michael, I said, turning to him, thank you for defending me when I couldn't defend myself. But now I need to make a decision that I should have made a long time ago. I looked one last time at Rachel, then at David, and finally at the entire congregation. I will no longer allow anyone, not even my own daughter, to treat me as if his love is a source of shame. With that, I began to walk back down the aisle, but this time not toward the back of the church. I walked straight to the main exit. But before I could reach the door, I heard Rachel's voice behind me, broken and desperate, Father, wait. I stopped, but did not turn around. And it was then that I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope to save not only my dignity, but also the soul of the daughter that I still loved, despite everything. What would she say next? And more importantly, would it be enough to undo years of hurt and disrespect? I stopped at the church entrance, but I didn't turn around immediately. The echo of my name off the sacred walls carried a hopelessness I hadn't heard in years. For a brief moment, I felt the same paternal compassion that had guided me through decades of silent sacrifice. Dad, please don't leave like this, Rachel said, her voice breaking. We can talk about this later. Not here, not in front of everyone. Slowly, I turned to face him. Tears streamed down his face, smudging the perfect makeup that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Later. I repeated, my voice echoing through the silent church. Rachel, you've been pushing me to later for 3 years. After graduation. After the office opened. After you established yourself in society. I took a few steps back toward the altar, but this time with a completely different purpose. I was no longer the humiliated father seeking approval. I was a man who had finally found his voice. Do you know what I discovered during all those afters? I continued, looking not only at Rachel, but at the entire congregation. That there would never be a right time for you to acknowledge the sacrifices I made. There would always be an excuse. There would always be something more important than honoring the man who dedicated his entire life to ensuring you could have this privileged life. David hesitantly approached Rachel, placing his hand on his shoulder. Mr. Thompson, he began, perhaps we can resolve this privately. No, I interrupted firmly. David, you are about to marry my daughter. You deserve to know exactly what kind of person she has become. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a worn manila folder. For years, I had kept documents and mementos from Rachel's upbringing, but I never imagined I would need to use them as evidence of my own worth as a father. Rachel, I said, opening the folder, you mentioned how embarrassed you were by my dirty work clothes at her graduations. Let me tell everyone here what those dirty clothes represented. I pulled a yellowed receipt from the folder. This is from the day of his high school graduation. I worked 18 hours straight that day, a double shift at the construction site, and then an entire night repairing Widow Henderson's roof to earn the extra $100 he needed to buy her graduation flowers. A murmur ran through the church. Some guests seemed genuinely touched, others looked away, uncomfortable with the emotional intensity of the moment. I came straight from work because I didn't want to miss a second of his graduation speech. You talked about perseverance, about never giving up on your dreams. Do you remember what you said about her inspiration? Rachel was silent, but I could see in her eyes that she remembered. You said you were inspired by the hardest working man you knew. His father, who never gave up, no matter how difficult the situation. I took another document out of the folder, a worn photograph. This photo was taken that night. You hugging me, still in my dirty work uniform, smiling like you were the proudest person in the world. I held the photo out so David could see it. Her expression changed noticeably as she looked at the image of a young, radiant Rachel hugging a visibly tired but extremely proud father. What happened to that girl, Rachel? I asked softly. When you decided that the man who gave you everything became a source of shame? Catherine Morrison stood up again. May I add something? She asked, her voice cutting through the tension. I nodded, curious about what else she had to say. Charles, she began, do you remember Christmas 2012? I thought for a moment. Yes, when I finished the floor in her living room. Exactly. You worked until Christmas Eve to finish the job in time for our family party. But you declined our invitation to stay for dinner because you had promised Rachel that you would bake Christmas cookies together that night. She turned to Rachel. How old were you? 17? 18? His father came home exhausted, covered in sawdust, but still spent the whole evening teaching you how to decorate cookies because it was a tradition you had kept since you were little. The silence in the church was absolute. I remember because the next day he showed up at my office with a tin of those cookies. He said Rachel had made them especially to thank our family for giving him work during the holidays. That she wanted us to know how grateful she was that we had such a dedicated father. Rachel covered her face with her hands. Catherine continued, relentless. I kept that tin for years. Not for the cookies, but for the card that came with it. Written by Rachel herself, thank you for giving work to the best dad in the world. He would do anything for me, and I would do anything for her. If you're following this journey of a father who sacrificed everything for love, don't forget to subscribe to his channel to find out how this heartbreaking story turns into something much more powerful. So tell me, Rachel, Catherine concluded, what happened to the girl who wrote those words? It was at that moment that Father Michael approached the microphone again. There is something else that needs to be said, he announced. Something that may explain why I am willing to interrupt this ceremony. All eyes turned to him. Charles Thompson is not just a parishioner of this church. 5 years ago, when our congregation was struggling financially, on the verge of losing this historic building, a man approached her offering help. He paused, looking directly at her. This man quietly donated $15,000, her entire retirement savings, to save this church. The condition? That no one would know. That there would be no public acknowledgement, no commemorative plaque, nothing. My stomach clenched. I had requested complete secrecy about this donation. When I asked why he was doing this, he said, Father, my daughter will marry someday. I want to make sure she has a sacred and beautiful place for her ceremony. Rachel's tears were now falling freely, but she made no effort to wipe them away. $15,000, Rachel, the priest repeated. Your father's entire retirement, secretly donated to ensure you could have the wedding of your dreams in the most beautiful church in town. David moved slightly away from Rachel, her expression showing shock and growing understanding of the magnitude of the sacrifices I had made. And today, the priest continued, that same man was treated like an embarrassing stranger at the ceremony made possible by her own savings. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It wasn't just discomfort or surprise. It was the collective weight of an injustice being laid bare. Rachel tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. David looked around the church, the flowers, the stained glass windows, the ornate altar, all funded in part by the man her bride had tried to hide. I put the documents back in the folder and tucked it under my arm. Rachel, I said calmly, for 25 years, every decision I made was based on what would be best for her. His education, his future, his happiness. Even when it meant sacrificing his own dignity, his comfort, his dreams. I took a step toward her. Today, for the first time in my life, I'm going to make a decision based on what's best for me. I looked at David, then at the congregation, and finally back at Rachel. I will no longer allow anyone, even my own daughter, to treat his love as if it were something to be ashamed of. With those words, I began walking toward the exit again. But this time, it wasn't an escape. It was a statement. And I knew from the absolute silence behind me and Rachel's ragged breathing, that finally, after all these years, my daughter was about to face the true consequences of her choices. What would she do when she realized she could lose not only her marriage, but also the only man who truly loved her unconditionally. I slowly turned to face Rachel. Her tears had completely smudged her makeup, and for the first time in years, she looked like the little girl I used to know again. Vulnerable, lost, needing his father. "What does he mean, Rachel?" I asked, my voice echoing through the silent church. "Do you want me to stay for more humiliation? To hear more about how I'm an embarrassment?" "No," she whispered, taking a hesitant step toward him. "Dad, I didn't know about the church. About the money you donated." "Of course you didn't," I replied calmly. "Because for the past 3 years, you never asked about my life. You never wanted to know how I was, what I did, how I paid my bills." David approached her, but there was something different in her expression. It was no longer the unconditional support of a loving fiancé. It was the confusion of a man who was discovering disturbing aspects about the person he had chosen to marry. "Rachel," David said slowly, "why did you never tell me about his father's sacrifices?" "Because it wasn't relevant," she replied automatically, but her voice sounded less convincing now. "It wasn't relevant?" David repeated, looking around the church, the flowers, the ornate altar, the stained glass windows. "He financed part of this church so you could have the perfect wedding, and that wasn't relevant?" It was at that moment that I noticed something changing in David's expression. It wasn't just confusion. It was disillusionment. Catherine Morrison rose again from her seat in the front row. "David," she said, her voice sharp, "I need to talk to you. Now." "Mom, we can talk later." "No," Catherine interrupted him firmly. "We can't." She walked over to where we were, passing guests who whispered among themselves, some discreetly recording with their cell phones. "David, do you remember our conversation about family values? About the kind of person you would want as his life partner?" David nodded slowly. "Then explain to me how you can marry a woman who treats her own father like trash. How can you build a family with someone who is ashamed of the people who sacrificed themselves for her?" The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It was the silence of a man re-evaluating a decision that would change his entire life. Rachel sensed the danger. "David, don't let her interfere in our relationship. This is between me and my father." "No," David said, her voice taking on a firmness I hadn't heard before. "Catherine is right. It says a lot about who you really are." It was at that moment that Father Michael stepped forward. "There is one more thing that needs to be said," he announced, looking directly at Rachel. "Something Charles asked me never to reveal, but which I now feel is necessary." My stomach clenched. There was nothing else I had asked him to keep secret, was there? 2 years ago, the priest continued, when Rachel was experiencing financial difficulties with her office, Charles came to see me. He was desperate, considering taking out a loan that would put her house at risk. Rachel turned pale. He wanted to help her, but he knew she would refuse any direct help. So he asked me to introduce her to his cousin, who is a partner in a large law firm in Atlanta. I felt my heart race. The priest was revealing something I had completely forgotten. "That contract that came out of nowhere 2 years ago, Rachel, the one that saved your firm from bankruptcy, was no coincidence. It was his father working behind the scenes to make sure you didn't lose everything you had worked for." Rachel staggered slightly, as if she had been physically struck. That's not true," she murmured. "Charles," the priest turned to me, "I'm sorry to break her confidentiality, but she needs to know. Tell her about the 3 nights you worked cleaning offices to pay for the favors you asked for to get that referral." I didn't want to remember that. Working as a janitor after spending the day on a construction site, all to make connections that could help Rachel without her knowing. "It's true," I admitted quietly. "You were about to lose everything. I couldn't let that happen." David looked at Rachel with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something worse. It was a complete loss of respect. "Let me get this straight," David said slowly. "His father secretly saved your business, donated his retirement savings to make sure you had a beautiful wedding, and you treat him like he's a disgrace?" Rachel tried to speak, but David continued. "And throughout our entire relationship, you led me to believe that you built everything on your own? That you were completely independent?" "David, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted her. "I understand that the woman I thought I was marrying doesn't exist. The real person is someone capable of such cruelty to her own father. At that moment, Catherine approached her son. David, you know what you need to do. David looked at his mother, then at me, and finally at Rachel. When he spoke, her voice was calm but laden with finality. Rachel, I can't marry you. The silence that followed was absolute. Some guests held their breath. Others whispered in disbelief. Rachel stood completely still for a moment, as if she hadn't understood the words. What? She finally asked, her voice almost inaudible. I can't build a life with someone who treats their family this way, David repeated, removing the wedding ring from his pocket and placing it on the altar. I can't have children with a woman who can be so cruel to the man who raised her. David, please, can we talk about this in private? There's nothing to talk about, he said firmly. You've shown me who you really are. And you're not someone I want to spend the rest of my life with. Rachel looked around the church, seeking support, but found only looks of disapproval or pity. Even some of his close friends seemed shocked by what they had discovered about her. It was at that moment that I realized I no longer needed an elaborate revenge or a complex plan. The truth had been revealed, and it was doing his own work. Rachel had lost not only her wedding, but also the respect of everyone who knew her. And all because finally someone had defended the dignity of a father who loved unconditionally, even when that love was not reciprocated. David started walking toward the exit, but stopped when he got close to me. Mr. Thompson, he said, extending his hand, thank you for showing me who she really is before it was too late. I shook his hand firmly, seeing a man who had made the most difficult and most correct decision of his life. But as David left the church followed by his mother, Rachel remained standing at the altar, alone, surrounded by the wreckage of what should have been the happiest day of her life. And for the first time in years, I felt that finally, my dignity had been restored. But what would happen now? How would Rachel react when she realized she had lost everything because of his pride? And would it be too late for her to learn the most important lesson of her life? Rachel stood at the altar for several long minutes after David left the church, as if she couldn't quite process what had just happened. The guests began to disperse quietly, some whispering to each other, others avoiding eye contact. I remained where I was, watching my daughter crumble under the weight of her own choices. Dad, she finally said, her voice breaking, please don't leave me here alone. I walked slowly toward her, each step echoing in the now nearly empty church. When I got close enough to see the tears streaming down his face, I felt that familiar paternal compassion trying to take hold of me. But this time, there was something different. It was no longer the blind compassion that led me to accept years of silent disrespect. It was the compassion of someone who finally understands that loving someone sometimes means letting them face the consequences of their actions. Rachel, I said softly, you're not alone because I abandoned her. You're alone because you chose to be alone. I know I've made mistakes, she sobbed. But he's my father. He should forgive me. Forgiveness, I replied, does not mean accepting being treated without dignity. And it does not mean pretending that her actions have no consequences. I looked around the church, the flowers my donation had helped maintain, the altar where I had imagined one day proudly giving away his daughter, the pews where I should have been sitting in the front row as the honored father. For 25 years, every choice I made was with his well-being in mind. I worked 3 jobs so he could have piano lessons. I sold my car so he could graduate. I used my retirement to save this church where you, his, would get married. You are family, she whispered. No, I replied calmly. Family doesn't treat family as a source of shame. Family doesn't hide sacrifices as embarrassing secrets. Family honors family. Father Michael approached quietly, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. Charles, he said, I know this is difficult, but... It's not difficult, I interrupted. For the first time in years, I am at peace. I turned to Rachel one last time. You lost his wedding today, but you may gain something much more important, the opportunity to become the person I always believed he could be. How? She asked, desperate. By learning that a person's worth is not measured by the size of his bank account or the elegance of his clothes, but by how he treats those who have sacrificed for her. I took a small key from my pocket and placed it in Rachel's hand. This is the key to the house where he grew up. It's been paid off for 5 years. I used my last retirement payment for that. Consider it his inheritance. She looked at the key, confused. Consider it? Today you showed that you don't understand the value of things that can't be bought. So I'm going to sell the house and donate the money to institutions that care for people who really need it." The shock on his face was visible. "Dad, you can't." "I can and I will," he said firmly. "Because I finally understand that giving everything to someone who doesn't value anything is a form of cruelty, both to me and to her." Catherine Morrison, who had stayed to witness our conversation, approached. "Charles," she said, "I would like to make you an offer. My husband passed away 2 years ago, and our house is too big for one person. I have an attached apartment that I don't use. I would be honored if he would consider living there." I looked at Catherine, surprised by her unexpected kindness. "I don't accept charity, Mrs. Morrison." "It's not charity," she smiled. "It's recognition. During all these years of watching you raise your daughter, I've learned a lot about true dedication. It would be a privilege to have someone of his character nearby." For the first time in years, I felt a door opening instead of closing. "Rachel," I said, looking one last time at my daughter, "when you learn to value the unconditional love you've received, when you can feel genuine gratitude instead of shame, when you understand that dignity is priceless, on that day, I'll be waiting to embrace him again." With those words, I began to walk toward the church exit. This time, it wasn't an escape. It was the first step of a man who had finally regained his dignity. 6 months later, I received a letter from Rachel. Inside was a photo of her serving food at a homeless shelter and a single sentence: "Dad, I finally understand what it means to love without expecting anything in return. Thank you for teaching me." I didn't reply right away. Some lessons take time to sink in. But I put the photo on my new bookshelf, next to the picture of her hugging me after high school graduation, when we were still a real family. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever felt undervalued by those who should love you, know that her dignity is not for sale. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how self-love is sometimes the greatest gift we can give both ourselves and those we love. Today, at 53, I have discovered that I no longer need anyone's approval to know his worth. And that discovery was the true happy ending he deserved.